It began not with a scream, but with the sound of glass shattering against porcelain. A thin, delicate teacup, bone china, patterned with faded violets that had once been a vibrant purple, spun for a moment on its gilt-edged rim before rolling, slow and deliberate, across the polished parlor floor. It left a meandering amber streak of Darjeeling tea in its wake, a tiny river of ruin on the Turkish carpet. The housemaid, Annie Fraser, froze where she stood, a silver tray gripped tight in her white-knuckled hands. Because the woman who had, only a heartbeat before, been sipping from that very cup. Her mistress, Mrs. Clara Wyndham, was no longer speaking. Her sentence, a mild remark about the unseasonable chill, had been cut in two. Her lips, which had been forming the word draft, had now slackened, then pursed, turning a strange and unsettling shade of violet that almost, but not quite, matched the pattern on the shattered china. Her eyes, wide and startled, were fixed on something beyond the ornate ceiling rose, something that wasn't there for anyone else to see. A final, silent witness to a private horror. By the time the doctor arrived, fussy and impatient from his interrupted supper, the room no longer smelled just of beeswax and Clara's signature lavender water. Beneath it lay a ghost of a scent, faint but unmistakable to a trained nose, the sweet, cloying fragrance of bitter almonds. Before we go further, let me ask you something. A question that would be put to Annie Fraser time and again in the grim weeks to come. If you were in that room, if your employer, the woman who held your livelihood and your reputation in her hands, collapsed mid-sentence, and you were the only other soul present, what would you do? Would you run, immediately, shouting for help, for the cook, for the master, for anyone? Or would you wait, just for a handful of heartbeats, standing perfectly still in the sudden, profound silence, to see if her chest would rise one more time? To be certain, absolutely certain, that she was gone? Drop your answer below, because the entire case, the suspicion that fell like a shroud, the very direction of the investigation, hinged on the question of how long Annie Fraser hesitated in that quiet, fragrant parlor. Belgrave Square, London, 1905. A neighborhood of quiet, moneyed respectability, where the only sounds after dark were the clip-clop of a late hansom cab and the whisper of a servant's broom on a basement step. Each four-story townhouse was a near-perfect replica of its neighbor. Tall, stern windows, freshly painted black wrought iron balconies, and pristine white steps. Behind those facades, an army of servants moved like well-drilled ghosts through the back corridors and below-stairs quarters, their lives dedicated to maintaining the flawless illusion of effortless grace above. To any passerby, number 27 was no different. Its brass knocker gleamed, its curtains hung straight. But inside, the air was different. It was heavier. The hierarchy was rigid, a microcosm of the empire itself. Upstairs resided the Wyndhams. Clara, a delicate beauty whose smiles had grown increasingly rare, and her husband, Captain Edward Wyndham, a man of stiff posture and colder eyes, lately returned from a long and, by all accounts, distinguished service in India. The heat of the subcontinent seemed to have baked all the softness out of him, leaving behind a desiccated husk of a man. Downstairs existed the staff. Mrs. Holloway, the cook, who ruled her kitchen kingdom with a rolling pin and a simmering resentment. Mr. Dobbs, the valet, whose face was as inscrutable as his master's. Young Thomas, the footman, all eager awkwardness. And Annie Fraser, the new parlor maid. Annie was 23, with hair the color of dark honey and a gaze that saw too much. She had come from a warren of streets in the East End with spotless, if brief, references from a deceased clergyman's family, a soft Scottish lilt clinging to her words like peat smoke, in a manner both obedient and unsettlingly observant. She was a quiet girl, the kind who could be in a room for an hour before you noticed her. But once you did, you found it difficult to look away. Within weeks, Mrs. Wyndham, who had cycled through a string of unsatisfactory maids, began to trust her with everything. The key to the tea caddy, the delicate Sèvres porcelain, her afternoon correspondence, even, eventually, her secrets. The captain rarely addressed Annie directly. But his gaze, when it fell upon her, was a physical weight, lingering on the nape of her neck or the deft movements of her hands. And when Clara took to her bed with the headaches that the doctor blandly called nervous exhaustion, and the neighbors whispered was a profound and lonely despair, it was Annie, and only Annie, who was permitted to bring the tonic. The house itself seemed to share its mistress's malady. The shutters were perpetually half-drawn, the room steeped in the cloying scent of perfume, and something else, something faintly sour lurking beneath, like spoiled milk. Annie kept her head down and her opinions to herself, but nothing in the house escaped her notice. She noted the way Captain Wyndham's jaw would tighten, a tiny muscle flickering, when the afternoon post brought a letter with a foreign stamp. The way Clara's hands would tremble as she folded those same letters, tucking them into her pocket unread, as though each one were a weight she could not bear. One evening, while polishing the silver in the butler's pantry, the murmur of voices from the study seeped under the door. She heard a name, sharp and clear amidst the low rumble. Eliza Harrow. It's blackmail, pure and simple. The captain hissed, his voice a low thrum of anger. The woman knows what happened in Bombay. She will not rest until she has bled me dry. Clara's reply was a thready whisper, barely audible. Then pay her, Edward. For God's sake, just pay her and let us be done with it. The next morning, while clearing the cold grate in the study, Annie found a half-burned letter in the hearth. The paper was thick and expensive, the ink blurred by moisture and heat, the signature half gone. But two words, nestled in the middle of a scorched paragraph, remained starkly legible. My child. From that day, Clara's behavior shifted. The nervousness curdled into something closer to fear. She ordered Annie to lock the parlor door whenever they had guests, to refuse any callers who did not present a written invitation. She started at the sound of the telephone bell, at footsteps on the stair, at the sudden shift in her husband's mood when he entered a room. In this climate of dread, Annie became indispensable. She was the calm at the center of the gathering storm. She brewed the calming teas, measured the sedative tonics, and wrote the polite, evasive letters that Clara could no longer bear to compose. And when Clara began, haltingly at first, to confide in her, not specifics, but shadows of sorrow, hints of a past mistake, Annie listened. She listened not with the gawping curiosity of servant, but quietly, intently, her hands still in her lap, her expression one of grave understanding. She listened like someone who already knew how the story would end, and was merely waiting for the characters to play their parts. On March 12, 1905, the household woke not to the smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee, but to a muffled sob. Mrs. Wyndham's small King Charles spaniel, a devoted little creature named Poppy, was found stiff and cold on the hearth rug in the morning room. The captain, his breakfast disturbed, blamed the cook for feeding it rich scraps. Mrs. Holloway, affronted, swore on her mother's Bible that she'd done no such thing, that the creature had been fit and lively when she'd last seen it trailing after its mistress the night before. But Annie, tasked with cleaning the room, noticed something the others, in their upset, had overlooked. The dog's porcelain water bowl was empty, but its ornate, fluted rim was stained with a dark, dried residue. Later, while preparing Mrs. Wyndham's afternoon tray, she saw the same residue on her mistress's favorite cup. China black, steeped strong, sweetened with 2 lumps of sugar, just enough, perhaps, to hide a certain underlying bitterness. That night, Clara wept in the parlor, the dead dog cradled in a silk shawl on her lap. She was all I had left, she whispered into the silence, a confession meant for the shadows. The only one who loved me, without condition. Annie stood by the door, a silent sentinel. She did not speak, did not move to offer a physical comfort that would have been an impertinence. She simply waited, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, until the storm of grief had passed. 2 weeks later, Clara complained of a pins and needles sensation in her fingertips. By April, her sight had begun to blur, making her embroidery a torment. By May, her legs had grown unsteady. She could no longer stand from her chair without a visible, humiliating tremor. The doctor, summoned again, tooted about female frailty and a weakness of nerves. He prescribed rest, warm milk with a dash of brandy, and a new, stronger tonic, a cloudy liquid in a blue glass bottle that Annie, and only Annie, was permitted to measure and administer. And so, each evening, the ritual was performed. The servant would pour a precise amount from the blue bottle into the porcelain cup, stir the mistress's tea until the liquid cleared, and then stand, a silent statue, as Clara Wyndham drank it down. Unseen by the household, another figure moved through the story. A young, ambitious constable named Michael Sullivan, who had been tasked with the mundane duty of noting reports of missing persons. A file on a Mrs. Eliza Harrow had landed on his desk. It was a thin file, dismissed by his superiors. A middle-aged woman of no particular importance, last seen near Belgrave Square. But Sullivan, with the doggedness of a man who believed in patterns, made a note of it. He also made a discreet visit to an apothecary on Cursitor Street, a place known to mix more than just remedies for gout. He asked about customers requesting certain specific compounds. The apothecary, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, remembered a well-dressed gentleman, and later, a quiet maid with a Scottish accent. He remembered because the maid had paid with a sovereign, and her hands had been shaking. One rain-swept afternoon, a visitor arrived. She gave her name as Mrs. Eliza Harrow. Annie, answering the door, took in the woman's appearance in a single, swift glance. Older than she'd imagined, her back ramrod straight, her clothes once fine, but now showing signs of careful repair. Her gloved hands, however, betrayed her rigid composure. They trembled faintly as she clutched her handbag. Annie announced her softly, watching Clara's face drain of all color, leaving her as pale and stark as the plaster bust of Athena on the mantelpiece. "You can't be here," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. She did not rise from her chaise lounge. "He said you'd left the country. He promised you were gone." Eliza Harrow offered a thin, bloodless smile. "And leave my daughter behind?" "I think not, Clara. A mother does not abandon her child so easily." The exchange that followed behind the firmly closed doors of the drawing room was brief, sharp, and overheard only in jagged fragments by Annie, who polished the balustrade on the landing outside. "He will not stand for it," Clara's voice strained. "My silence has a price, as does his Eliza's colder, harder. You don't know what he's capable of." But one word, spoken with a venom that pierced the solid wood, carried clearly to Annie's ears: blood. That evening, Captain Wyndham returned home late, his breath smelling of brandy, his greatcoat damp with rain. A low, furious argument erupted from behind the closed door of his study. Then an abrupt silence, more frightening than the shouts, broken only by the definitive clink of a decanter against glass. When Annie entered to clear the room the next morning, the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. And there, on the starched white cuff of a shirt the captain had left draped over a chair, was a smear of something dark and rusty. Not ink. He brushed past her as she worked, his face a stony mask, offering no explanation. Eliza Harrow was never seen again. By the height of summer, Clara Wyndham was dead. The coroner, a pragmatic man with a heavy caseload, listed the cause as heart failure, though the attending doctor admitted privately to the police that her decline had been mysteriously swift and her symptoms, in retrospect, atypical. At the brief, perfunctory inquest, Captain Wyndham sat stiff and expressionless in his black morning suit, the very picture of a grieving, stoic military man. Annie Fraser, pale but perfectly composed in her one good dress, gave her testimony in a clear, soft voice. She spoke of her mistress's long illness, her frailty, the doctor's regular visits. She stated that no one, not even the dear lady herself, could have foreseen the suddenness of the end. The jury, comprised of respectable tradesmen who knew their place, was satisfied. Death by natural causes. Clara Wyndham was buried in a quiet corner of Kensal Green Cemetery, her headstone inscribed with the simple, hollow epitaph, "Beloved wife." But the story, like a stubborn weed, refused to rest. A week after the funeral, Mrs. Holloway the cook gave her notice, muttering about bad air and ghosts in the parlor that rattled the cups in their saucers. The valet, Dobbs, a man who had seen much and said little, followed soon after, telling the employment agency he'd seen the captain and the parlourmaid in a whispered, candlelit conversation in the library long after midnight, a conversation that stopped the moment he entered. And when a constable, the young, persistent Constable Sullivan, came knocking quietly and discreetly on the glossy black door of number 27, it wasn't about Mrs. Wyndham's death. Not officially. It was about the disappearance of a Mrs. Eliza Harrow, last seen calling at this address. A warrant was secured. Annie Fraser's small, neat room in the attic was searched. The air smelled of soap and starch cotton. It was in the bottom of a drawer, tucked beneath a stack of perfectly folded linen, that Constable Sullivan's hand closed around it, a tarnished silver locket. Inside, secured under a glass front, was a curl of dark, baby-fine hair and a tiny, faded photograph of a solemn-eyed child of about 3. The reverse bore a finely engraved inscription, "To my Emily, Mama will return." When questioned, Annie's composure did not break, but it grew brittle. She claimed it was her own keepsake, a memory of a younger sister lost to a fever in Glasgow. But Constable Sullivan had done his homework. Records from the Glasgow parish showed no record of an Emily Fraser, nor any sibling for Annie, whose family had consisted of a widowed mother and no one else. Meanwhile, in a laboratory that smelled of chemicals and old wood, a forensic analyst, a new and still suspect profession, conducted tests on the stained shards of the violet-patterned teacup. The methods were rudimentary, but they detected traces of cyanide compounds. Not enough to be conclusive in a court of law, given the contamination, but more than enough to fuel the engine of suspicion. Captain Wyndham, when interviewed, was vehement in his defense of Annie. He insisted she was loyal, devoted, almost saintly in her care for his late wife. He even produced a letter, allegedly written by Clara in her final days, which praised Annie for her unfailing devotion and friendship. It was a powerful piece of evidence, but a handwriting analyst, consulted by a detective with a hunch, found irregularities. The flowery, feminine script was a good imitation, but the C in Clara looped the wrong way. The ink, under magnification, bled into the paper fibers as though written by an unsteady hand, or by a hand utterly unpracticed in replicating another's. When confronted with this discrepancy, and with the locket, Annie did not crumble. She simply shut down. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slid from her chair in a dead faint. Upon being revived with smelling salts, her strength seemed gone. She looked at the stern faces surrounding her and whispered only, "I only ever wanted to help her, to ease her suffering." It was not a confession of murder, but in the ears of the police, it was a confession of something. Here is where the story turns, where the public's fascination, stoked by the penny dreadfuls, reached a fever pitch. Because just when the police were preparing to charge Annie Fraser with murder, something surfaced from the ledgers of a London bank that changed the entire landscape of the case. A diligent clerk cross-referencing accounts discovered an unclaimed deposit of £500, a fortune made months earlier. It was transferred under the name A. Fraser, but the withdrawal slip and the authorizing signature on the Wyndham account was unmistakably that of Wyndham. It was hush money, a payment from a master to the maid. Investigators, now armed with a new angle, dug like terriers. They found that in the same week Clara died, Captain Wyndham had paid off substantial gambling debts to a club in Mayfair. Furthermore, he had, just 2 months prior, renewed and significantly increased a life insurance policy in his wife's name. Policies that now made him a very wealthy widower. Suddenly, the fragile, pale servant girl in the dock no longer looked like the sole, scheming villainess. She looked like a pawn, a tool in the hands of a ruthless man, a frightened girl from the slums, perhaps coerced, perhaps bribed, to administer the poison that removed an inconvenient wife and a blackmailing mother-in-law. But when police returned to number 27 to question the captain with this new, damning evidence, they found the house empty, echoing with the ghosts of its recent past. He had vanished, leaving behind only a single sheet of writing paper on the marble mantelpiece. The note, scrawled in his hurried hand, read, "Tell Annie she did beautifully." It was a sentence that could be read as praise for her performance on the stand, or as the final, cruel compliment of a master manipulator to his dupe. Months passed. The newspapers, having a field day, dubbed it the Wyndham Mystery or the Poisonous Parlour Maid. Annie Fraser was tried nonetheless, the Crown arguing she was an accomplice, accused of administering poison at her master's command. The evidence was largely circumstantial. The public opinion, fed by sensational headlines, was savage. She maintained her innocence, or rather, a version of it. "I only ever did as I was told," she repeated, her voice small in the cavernous courtroom. "I never asked what was in the bottle. It was the doctor's medicine. It was my place to give it." But the jury of 12 men, their minds poisoned by the whispers of a class who believed servants were capable of great cunning and little morality, did not believe her. Servants, they decided, knew more than they admitted. They saw the opportunities for blackmail, for advancement, for twisted revenge. She was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. And that, officially, was where the case ended. Justice, of a sort, had been served. But history, real, messy, unresolved history, rarely ends so neatly. Because 2 years later, builders renovating number 27 for its new, oblivious owners broke through a loose panel beside the parlor fireplace, a panel that had been hidden behind a heavy mahogany desk. Inside the dusty cavity was a small, rusting tin box, the kind used for storing biscuits or tobacco. Inside the box lay 3 items: a single ladies' kid leather glove, a folded letter, brittle at the edges, and a thin, 6-sided glass vial, its contents long since evaporated, but its printed paper label, though foxed, still perfectly legible. Eliza Harrow and Company, apothecaries of Clerkenwell. The letter inside the box was never made fully public, its contents deemed too scandalous, but fragments of it were copied into a police evidence ledger that survives in the archives. It was written in Clara Wyndham's own, now familiar hand. "If anything should happen to me, know that it was not my illness that took me, nor was it my doing. There are debts of the heart one cannot pay twice, and some sins follow you from one life to the next. I am trapped. Tell Emily I am sorry. Tell her I loved her from the first, and I love her still." The name, Emily, appeared again. Not a daughter of the house. Not a dead sister. Something else. Cross-referenced with old records, a dedicated clerk discovered that before her marriage to the dashing captain, Clara Wyndham's maiden name had been Clara Harrow. Eliza Harrow, the dismissed governess, the blackmailer, the woman who vanished, wasn't her enemy. She was her mother. And Emily? Perhaps the child in the locket's photograph. Perhaps the debt of the heart. Perhaps another secret, another life buried beneath the rigid layers of class, convention, and silence that define the age. In the autumn of 1908, a waterman found a body caught in the reeds near Tilbury Docks. It was male, mid-40s, badly decomposed, but the remnants of the clothing, a pair of trousers with a military cut, a jacket button from the 3rd Bengal Lancers, were consistent with a uniform. The description matched that of the vanished Captain Edward Wyndham. His pockets contained no identification, only a sodden but preserved photograph in a sealed leather pouch. It was a studio portrait of Annie Fraser, not smiling, but with a faint, knowing curve to her lips, her dark honey hair tied back with a simple, dark ribbon. On the reverse, written in the captain's unmistakable hand, was an inscription that has puzzled historians ever since: "For loyalty beyond love." The coroner, faced with the body of a disgraced man and no evidence of foul play, called it suicide. The press, ever dramatic, called it just end. A guilty conscience claiming its due. But there was one final, chilling detail buried deep in the case files: an invoice dated just weeks before his body was found for a shipment of personal effects. It was addressed to Miss A. Fraser, care of the Clerkenwell Apothecary. The shipping company's copy bore a signature for the sender. The name was written in a slanted, elegant script: E. Harrow. When we tell stories about poison, we like our villains clear and our victims pure. We crave the simple morality tale. But in houses like number 27, Belgrave Square, guilt was rarely so straightforward. It seeped quietly, insidiously, into the teacups, the wallpaper, the very air the inhabitants breathed. It was a poison brewed from shame, silence, and the brutal constraints of a society that prized reputation above truth. Perhaps Clara Wyndham was both a victim and, in some way, a participant in her own destruction. A mother who had abandoned a child, now being blackmailed by her own mother. Perhaps Annie Fraser was both a pawn and an accomplice. A woman who saw a path out of poverty, even if it was a dark one, her loyalty a weapon turned against her. Perhaps Captain Wyndham, driven by debt, shame, and a ruthless desire for self-preservation, simply finished what someone else, his wife, his mother-in-law, his maid, had already begun. The truth, like the faint, ghostly scent of almonds in that sunlit parlor, lingers long after the doors are closed and the players have departed. In 1910, during a routine inventory at Holloway Prison, a small set of personal effects was logged from an inmate recently deceased of consumption. The inmate was Annie Fraser. Among her meager possessions were a hair ribbon of dark blue velvet, a tarnished child's locket containing a curl of dark hair, and a sealed envelope of heavy cream paper. It was addressed, in a hand that was not her own, to Emily H. The envelope was never opened. The prison governor, wary of the notoriety of the case and bound by strict rules, ordered it placed in his storage as part of the official evidence. Its contents, the final unread words of this tragedy, remain sealed in the Metropolitan Police Archives to this day. Next time, in Trace Crime Files, Poison in the Parlor, Part 2, we'll unseal that letter. We will follow the faint, cold trail of Emily H., the name that connected a servant, a mistress, and a secret love that refused to die. We will go to Clerkenwell and to Bombay to uncover what really happened in a bungalow under the Indian sun. Because in London, 1905, the walls have long memories, and some poisons, the kind not kept in bottles, never, ever fade. This was Trace Crime Files. Subscribe for more stories where truth is stranger than fiction, and justice is never as simple as it seems.